Hello. Can you guys hear me okay? It's lovely to see you all. That was a really beautiful and moving tribute, Nick. Thank you so much. There's so much that you brought to life about Harpal and all those things that are so difficult to capture in a human being. I probably would be told off by Dad today for not having prepared my speech very thoroughly. But in my defense, I would say I've written what I wanted to say maybe already, and I hope those of you who haven't read it will make time. We are typically not lost for words, Bras, and we tend to speak at great length. and it's a long article. Ella told me Dad would have been very upset that Lolcar exceeded its usual 20 pages and ran to about 28. But Dad lived a long and fruitful life. And his journey is a remarkable one. I think I'm only allowed to speak for 10 minutes, so I'm only going to be able to refer to it. I was asked sometimes in interviews, if you ever go to medical school interviews or job interviews, very typical in medicine, people will say, well, who has been your mentor? And I would think in the medical profession, and in that moment, I would think, I actually have no idea of a single doctor who's inspired me. Is that terrible to say? And it wasn't possible for me to say that Harpal was my mentor in a very meaningful way. He taught me many lessons. He was always there for me when I personally needed him. He was incredibly supportive, generous, warm, friendly man, but he was also very erudite. It's always a question with me why more people don't become communists. Perhaps that's a straight, when you look at that interview, I recorded that interview, by the way, that first speech at the Oxford Union, I went with him, that was many years ago. Oxford Union often publicise their speeches. Have you noticed? They go up online. Harpal's, wherever he spoke, and he spoke beautifully, he wouldn't be publicised. And I think that's not without reason. There's a stereotype they would like to present of communism, of socialism, of our movement, that you're inept, that you lack culture, that you don't know about the world, that your desires and your sentiment is somehow naive and immature and you'll grow out of it. And Harpal blew that sky high. He once was invited to speak. Do you know Simon Sebag Montefiore?
Yes.
He wrote a book, he wasn't known at the time, he wrote a book called Young Stalin, Koba. Koba was the first early revolutionary name that Stalin took before he was Stalin, when he was Joseph Vissarionovich. And he wrote this book, Young Stalin, and so Channel 4 were inviting him in to do a big piece on promoting the book, because it's basically, though it has some detail in it, it's a kind of standard anti-Soviet book. And they searched around and they found this, Stalin Society, what's that? We'll invite someone from the Stalin Society. They invited Harpal to come in. Harpal went with Ella for an interview with Jeremy Vine, I think it was, I'm not sure, with the presenters of Newsnight. And they kept him for an hour talking. Author Simon Sebag Montefiore, Harpal, and clearly they were looking for an embarrassing soundbite to kind of counterpose to Simon Sebag Montefiore. It tells you how bad Stalin is. Harpal. And I wish I'd been there, because if I'd been there, I would have videoed it and we'd have a record of it. We looked for that news. It was quite a long piece. It was about a 20-minute interview in the middle of, primetime news night. And it was like Harpal was never there. They just decided his words were too powerful, too strong, too much of a juxtaposition, exposed the truth so beautifully and elegantly, and that despite keeping him for an hour, there wasn't a single soundbite they could use that fulfilled their purpose. So better to write him out of history. And I feel a bit like that's what they've done with Harpal. There was a time when he was invited to speak on the news. I remember the time of Indira Gandhi's assassination. Indian, we'll find a member of the Indian community, India's Workers' Association, Harpal Brar, news. After that interview, he spoke there, and he just spoke about Indian politics, Indian affairs, but in a way that laid bare the class essence and the reality of the drama of what was really happening that led to these dramatic events. And it was so enlightening. I used to walk around, and I was a young boy walking in Boxmoor in VG stores. You don't know this shop, probably it doesn't exist anymore. And I'd go in, and random people out of Boxmoor, Hemel Hempstead, Hertfordshire, Reaction Place, had seen him on the news and would come up to him and tell him how they'd seen him, what a wonderful speaker he was, how great he, you know. So he had this electrifying effect on his audience, that he would enlighten them, he would give them knowledge, he'd connect with them, and he'd help to move them further towards a greater understanding. That was an amazing talent, an amazing ability. And it was really what led him to, through his inquiry, through his love of history, as Nick pointed out, to develop his political understanding to the point that he decided to dedicate his life to it. And that could have been many things. He was born, as many of you will know, in India, in Punjab, in a very small village called Fatanwala. And he was a descendant of this Punjabi horse trader and farmer living in Punjab. Sikh man, raised as a Sikh. And there he was, in an insular little village, in a colonial backwater, in a time when India was a colony. And yet, great and dramatic events touched him and shaped his life. He lived through partition, and he used to kind of refer to it obliquely to me, without ever really talking about it in depth. And it's almost in retrospect that I've kind of put together the story. But, you know, at just the age of 8, he witnessed partition. And he lived in a village that would have been kind of almost 50-50 Sikh Muslim. And yet, because partition happened, his village was ripped in half, really. Lahore, which is now the capital of Pakistan, was his local town. It was closer to him than Delhi. It was closer to him than Ludhiana. It was closer than anywhere. So that his family used to ride to Lahore, you know? And yet, whole of my life, I went to Punjab, I went to India with him, and I never had a sense that that town was even nearby, let alone the town that essentially I and my ancestors were basically from. And his best friend was Pakistani, his best friend was a Muslim boy in the village, and he lost that friend. And the character and nature of his life and India's life and his village's life was irrevocably changed. And though I'd visited the village many times, it wasn't until recently I started looking on Google Maps and just realizing the geography, the proximity, I realized what that meant. That you take people, you rend them limb from limb, you use one section of the population against another, this great communalism that ripped the country apart. And we're still living, India is still living with that, Pakistan's still living with that. And that this again was not just a British act, not just a colonial act, but the act of a Labour government. And so these events which were formative, that he wouldn't have understood at the time, I don't think he's a man of tremendous energy and a great fun, and he would tell you beautiful stories about his village life. He used to tell me all the time about getting in trouble with his dad. There was a game he used to play. He was sent, as a bright boy, so he was sent to boarding school, and there was a game he used to play called Pistols, and so they would take the matchbox, and they would take a phosphorus tip match, and they would fire it to each other, like a little game. And he managed somehow to burn his dormitory down, playing this game, and his dad would give him a thupper and had to pay for the rebuilding of the dormitory. So you can see he was full of life and mischief. And yet from this background, somehow, he gained a love for knowledge, despite the fact that if you knew my family, if you went to the village, you'd go into the house and you'd see there's not a book in his house. There's one, we used to go and visit the village, there was one book on dog breeding. And we go back 20 years later, that book is still there, and there's basically the kids now go to school, but they're much more erudite. But he came from a background where it wasn't normal to read deeply, to learn, to have knowledge, to understand history. And yet somehow he developed a love for knowledge and understanding that propelled him from there to his local towns, to the capital of Punjab, to the capital of India, to Delhi. He studied a bachelor in law and English and Punjabi. And from there he decided, immigration laws are coming in. He had a wider view on the world. He was already reading about the Vietnam War. He was reading about colonialism and the anti-colonial struggles. He attended his first demonstration there. The first demonstration, he says, came about after the assassination of the great Congolese liberation fighter Patrice Lumumba. And so he would have been in a milieu in Delhi of people whose consciousness was awaking, who were becoming enlightened in their outlook, and were becoming, involved in anti-imperialist politics. I have no doubt he would have met communists there. And yet he wasn't yet a communist, but he was awakening. And then he journeyed to London, to the heart of the empire, the heart of the metropolis. And still, when I think about London in 1962, when he arrived, it connects very much with what he would say in speeches, that, immigrants don't come here for the warm welcome, for the good food, or the good weather. The first things he did, he said, well, buy a warm coat. He cut his hair. He quickly put aside his religion as he started to read. But he found, despite the fact it was a deeply racist society. My mother's English. I feel myself to be English. And yet at a certain point, as you grow in the society, you realize, there's something wrong with not being totally English. This suddenly dawns on you. It hits you at some point, sooner or later. You lose friends, you get in fights, you're not quite sure why. Is there something wrong with me? But it takes a while to realize, take consciousness to realize, nothing wrong with you. There's nothing even wrong with those people who are directing that feeling at you, that this is a legacy of colonialism put in the people to divide them and control them. And to overcome that and realize it is one thing, but then to get rid of it from society is another. And Harpal set himself that task, amongst many other tasks, of raising the British people above racism. His deepest and dearest comrades were British, English people that he met here. Also comrades amongst the Indian community and Indian Workers Association. He absolutely transcended what otherwise can drag you down and set you against yourself. Just as Nick said, he had a free inquiring mind. He was able to see what's wrong, and he was able to look beyond it. He realized the importance of unity. He realized the importance of workers of all countries coming together to overcome and transcend these problems. And so without giving you an entire history of his life, I would say that in itself is remarkable. He ultimately went on to write a beautiful book. He wrote many books, and I can't refer them to you all. We've got a stall of his books upstairs, and without wanting to do a party commercial, I really encourage you to get hold of some of those books and read them. Have a look at the titles, see which are the ones that interest you. But if partition in a very real way, and the history of British colonialism, though he said, he never met, and most Indians never met, one of the colonial class, and yet they were deeply affected by it. I genuinely think they had a very formative experience on him looking back, and that with Marx we can say that the bourgeoisie, above all else, creates its own grave diggers. And I think they had a big part in shaping Harpal's outlook in history. He wrote a beautiful book, Inqilab Zindabad, which means long live revolution. And it's the story of one of his great heroes, one of my great heroes. Shaheed means kind of martyr, Bhagat Singh, who was someone probably you don't know, or you might. Most British people, not every Indian knows who he is, because they're always told the story that it was Gandhiji that liberated India, pacifism, great story of this great passive, just keep on beating me. Queues and queues of Indians will go up and the British police will beat us and then our heads will bleed and we'll go to the back of the queue for another beating, and eventually they get so tired of beating us we'll be free. And that myth, it's a total myth, is still put about as the way in which India won its freedom. It's not true. And it's a degrading myth, and it's a misleading myth for the mass of the people who are in servitude, because there's nothing so liberating as a revolution. Revolutions, Harpal used to say, are the festivals of the oppressed, at which they right historic injustices and wrongs. And so he was inspired by the October Revolution, but he was also inspired by the revolutionary teaching of Bhagat Singh, and he wrote a beautiful book about it, Inqilab Zindabad. But what amazed me, because I started writing this speech around the 100th anniversary of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre and presentation, and researching it, looking into it, seeing the cool, calculating, laissez-faire fundamentalism of the Victorians, the way they ruled over this enormous territory as a company. It's like a Star Trek myth, isn't it? You have a company that rule an empire. No, they ruled as a company, and they ruled over entire people, an entire subcontinent. And actually that became the model for the whole of capitalist existence. But they would be so cruel as to let millions die in famine, because of their laissez-faire free market fundamentalism. And yet Harpal would say, but if you haven't read Marx, you haven't understood it. Because despite the barbarity, he would also see the revolutionary effect of dissolving the Indian village, of bringing them into the modern age, of empowering them, of building a nation of India, of building a proletariat of India, of building the working people of India, who would then come to free and liberate the people. So that incredible power of Marx, Dad always saw. There are two very small things that I didn't write in the obituary that I really would ask you to read, and I would just want to read them with you now. And I'm sorry if someone else was going to say them, because they're well-known things that are often said when great revolutionaries and our great comrades pass from us. But this, I think, is a beautiful phrase. This was from How the Steel is Tempered by Nikolai Ostrovsky, and this used to be the almost the oath of induction into the Communist Party. And this is what he wrote. He said, "Man's dearest possession is life. It's given to him but once, and he must live it so as to feel no torturing regrets for wasted years, never know the burning shame of a mean and petty past, so live that dying he might say, all my life, all my strength were given to the finest cause in all the world, the fight for the liberation of mankind." I was touched by the huge number of beautiful messages we received from around the world, actually, as well as our comrades and all of the people, so many of the people that Harpal had touched. But I think it was Comrade Keith who sent me that message as part of his message of condolence, and said, that in his opinion, Harpal had lived such a life. And I think that's true. You have to be very careful of being hyperbolic when you're talking about your loved ones and exaggerating their importance. But Harpal definitely took the flame of socialism. He kept it alive with his optimism, with his work, with his writings, with his thought. He became a practical leader of a large section of the working class community. He participated in many of the greatest struggles of the working class at our time. And it's unfortunate. Marx always said there are decades in which nothing seems to happen, and then days come in which those decades happen, are embodied. And Harpal, it was his misfortune to live through very reactionary times when the revolutionary movement was on a downgrade. But it's very clear to me, if you look at the world, that the times are coming when the teaching of Marxism-Leninism will be incredibly important. And so I really think, that it bears, I'm going to end on this really, which is a little excerpt from a speech that Stalin gave on the death of Comrade Lenin, and was very dear to Harpal, and I think he would have liked us to think about and have read today. And he said this, "Comrades," and I apologize, many of you are communists, but many of you are not. And I don't think there's an inseparable gulf that divides the two. You're all good human beings. You're all people who are loved by myself, by my family, by Harpal. And I'm so grateful that you are here to share this moment. But it'll do us no harm at all to think about this message, because Harpal really dedicated his life to trying to help humanity. And this was really the message that touched him very deeply. He said, "Comrades," this is Stalin speaking about Lenin, "we communists are people of a special mold. We're made of a special stuff. We are those who form the army of the great proletarian strategist, the army of Comrade Lenin. There is nothing higher than the honor of belonging to this army. There's nothing higher than the title of member of the party whose founder and leader was Comrade Lenin. It's not given to everyone to be a member of such a party. It's the sons of the working class, the sons of want and struggle, the sons of incredible privation and heroic effort, who before all should be members of such a party. That is why the party of Leninists, the party of the communists, is also called the party of the working class. Departing from us, Comrade Lenin enjoined us to hold high and guard the purity of the great title of member of the party. We vow to you, Comrade Lenin, we shall fulfill your behest with honor. I think Harpal clearly was not a member of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, but he fought to rebuild and refound a revolutionary spirit of communism that would truly serve the mission of liberating working people in Britain, because for all that it's a privileged country, we can see an increasing number of our people. 20% of us live in quite abject poverty, actually, here in the heartland of imperialism, and certainly in the world. Since the Soviet Union fell, my whole life has been characterized by watching this period of colonial war, colonial and savage reaction. For the last 15 months, we've been watching a genocide in Gaza unfold. And I do think we're going to have to ask ourselves, we're going to look back and say, what did we do about it? And sometimes it's frustrating how little we seem to be able to do. But Harpal strove to build a movement that would be able to educate the British working people and to help them to play a part in the liberation of mankind. And definitely going from us, he would say, we should guard the party as we guard the apple of our eyes. So thank you for listening to me, and thank you for coming and celebrating Harpal's last day.
I would like to invite now to speak the Cuban ambassador,